Hey guys, welcome back to Unique Minds of the Okanagan. I'm Rylan Kinnan and I have Brenden Studer here from Westbank Museum. How's it going today?
Good, and yourself?
I'm not too bad. So, Brenden, what honestly got you into being a historian?
Well, so that's a bit of a story. So I've always been interested in history ever since I was very young. And like particularly with military history, I was one of those kids that liked watching the old war movies and whatnot with my dad and so on, things like, and I'm talking like old movies like Longest Day with John Wayne and things like that. And then and that got me into like really exploring the history more. And then I was probably 5 or 6 when my dad told me, like, your grandpa, he served in World War II. It's like, nah, there's no way that he did. And it's like, 'cause my dad, he'd sometimes tell kind of tall tales at times, and so I didn't believe him. It's okay. Well, next time that we go to visit him, I'll get him to show you his medals. And so we usually went down to southern Alberta, where my dad is from, to go and visit my grandparents at least once a year at that time. And so I would go. We went down that summer, and and as we were getting ready to leave, I reminded Dad, what about the medals? Oh yeah, Dad, Brenden wanted to see your medals. And so Grandpa gets up out of the chair and goes into the bedroom and takes him a little bit, and then he comes out with this little white box, and he opened it up, and it was just like, it was kind of like a, like, just blown away.
Flabbergasted, yeah.
Yeah, like that, like did just like, it's like my grandpa was part of history, kind of thing. Cool. And so that really, like, that moment like really kind of kicked things into hyperdrive. Like, that's the moment that I really accredit with becoming a historian. There's also other steps of like just taking history in university and realizing, you know what, like, this is what I enjoy looking into. Like, and it's not even necessarily, and it's developed out of just military history. That's still one of my favorite aspects to go on, but it's still it's developed more into other areas of history as well, and especially starting to work in the museum industry, it has started to go towards like different communities and whatnot, because I've worked at the Fort St. John Museum, where I'm originally from, and then I've also worked at the Oliver Museum in southern Okanagan, and then here now as well. And so it's like learning the stories of different communities, because every community has a story to tell. There's so many people that think that, oh well, like my town, it doesn't have any history. It hasn't even been around for 100 years. There's a lot of history that can happen in 100 years.
Well, it's very interesting when it comes to the aspect of Westbank and West Kelowna. I'm sure you have a lot to say in regards to the argument of it being dragged into the West Kelowna label.
So, I mean, I've only been here recently. I've only been at the Westbank Museum here for about a year now, so I don't have that much personal commentary on it, but I do have, like, there are individuals that I've met that have come through the door that are longtime citizens that are that are very passionate about, no, it's Westbank, not West Kelowna.
For very sure, because when you think about it, it's like these people have built a whole life and identity about themselves living in Westbank, and then just to be like, no, you just live in West Kelowna now.
Yeah, and I mean, the area of downtown, like the downtown core of West Kelowna, is still considered Westbank, like even by people that know the city as West Kelowna. Yeah. The like downtown is still Westbank to them, and then like there's Glen Rosa and Shannon Lake and Lakeview Heights and all of those different areas. They were all like their own distinct communities at the time, because Glen Rosa is also one of the older areas that like the Gorman brothers, the Gorman brothers and their families were living in at the time, as well as the Fickey family and so on. Lakeview Heights didn't start until after the Second World War, really, when there was the Veteran Land Act that had properties slotted out for veterans that came to Lakeview Heights. And then Shannon Lake, I'm not sure the exact history aside from that. I know the original Westbank post office was up by Shannon Lake. So there's history there as well. Yeah. But all of those areas, they were really considered like distinct communities and so on. So
Little sub areas in West Kelowna or West Bank, essentially.
yeah, and it owed to like the area before it became the city of West Kelowna and being fully incorporated. It was like the district of West Side or something along those lines. That kind of started to amalgamate those together. So I mean, it's been even tricky for me to kind of navigate that. It's like, when do I call it West Kelowna? When do I call it West Bank? And for me, it's who, like, depends on who you're talking to.
Oh, for sure.
Really, for me, because it's like, if you want to call it West Bank, I will call it West Bank. If you want me to call it West Kelowna, I'll call it West Kelowna. I can go either way with it.
I think it hits a personal spot with everybody, because I myself, everything kind of like that new development just over the bridge, I would say is more of like a West Kelowna. And then personally, like, I still would call this place, like this area, West Bank. And you know, when I grew up in Penticton personally, and I remember specific things every time passing through here, and I always remember it as West Bank.
Excuse me. Yeah, I agree 100% that, like, because there is even that little sliver right on the other side of the bridge that is like the addresses there still are Kelowna. So it's like, well, yeah, that West Kelowna, sure, because it's like you have South Kelowna and Southeast Kelowna and East Kelowna over on the east side of the bridge as well. So that in itself kind of makes sense. And then the other thing with West Bank and the name is that, like, you have the West Bank First Nation as well, and like that's their name that they have for their band, and so and they're down closer towards the bridge. So it's like, at what point is it West Bank and what point is it West Kelowna? Yeah. So it's tricky, and it's even when you read into the referendums at the time, it's like it was marginal difference between, like, it was like less than 1% difference between West Bank and West Kelowna for the naming. So yeah, it's definitely, like I said, something that's a bit tricky to go through.
So as a historian yourself, bear with me. I don't want this to come off as an offensive aspect. You have a lot of knowledge in your mind. Is that something that you ever have an issue of not thinking about anything, if that makes sense? I
mean, sometimes it's good to just, like, essentially turn your brain off and like just watch a show, like watch some show that's complete nonsense, or something like that, or even just to kind of like essentially give yourself a brain break, basically. Like, so if that's the answer to the that we're trying to go towards, like, yes, there are times that there is that, but, like, I mean, when I'm at work and when I'm thinking about stuff, or even doing research just for personal projects that I have at home, it's there's things constantly running through your mind.
Because you always have new stuff coming in through either people donating, you know, people finding things and just inquiring if you guys have any information on that kind of stuff, and you're always learning. Like, you always have interesting stuff that you need to kind of like remember, and just kind of like, if you add it on display or something like that, you have like a little bit of like a tidbit as to, like, oh, you know, this person so brought it in, and, you know, you're keeping track of a lot of this stuff. I'm sure you don't necessarily know a personal story of every single item in the museum, but, you know, it's one of those things where it's like you're the storyteller of what's here. So,
yeah, you're absolutely right that it's like you have to kind of know the history, especially if it's something that is coming in as a donation that is linked to one of the pioneer families of Westbank. Like, recently we had a large donation come in from the Griffin family, which is one of the more significant families of Westbank, and so, like, needing to really go in and be like, hey, so, like, there's things here that are from Vancouver. When was this person in Vancouver? And things like that. And, like, just because the stuff doesn't necessarily itself have a link to Westbank. It does through the person because it's part of their life story, basically. Like there's the one individual in particular that I'm referring to is Merle Griffin, and she spent a period of time down in Vancouver in the 1940s, and then came back to Westbank afterwards, and she kept all of these tickets and receipts for her time at the YWCA in Vancouver and whatnot, and like those kind of things are unique to that person, and it's part of their story, and it's part of their story of their life, and if they spent a significant part of it in Westbank, that's important to us as well as a story to tell.
No, that's you got to keep those. It's almost like you have a map, right? And then you take the pin, you do the line, you do a pin, and you're kind of tracing the story as to like trying to fill in gaps and stuff like that with important figures and families, at least. As
100%. There shortly after I started here, we had a large donation coming from the Painter family, which is another family that owns the one fruit stand in Westbank here, and they had made a donation of one member of their family that is connected to the Painters through marriage, and it turned out that person, like, he spent time in the Okanagan, but he was over in Kelowna, but it took a lot of going through and like connecting dots to figure out, okay, like where was he, and how did he get here, and like did he live in Westbank at some point, so that we're not
just displaying some random person.
Well, so that yeah, exactly, and it ended up being that no, he didn't spend time in Westbank, and so he ended up taking that collection over to the Kelowna Museum, and passing over to them because there was relevant history to them.
Yeah, definitely lots of stuff you don't really think about from an outsider's perspective with coming into this kind of environment. What are some overlooked things possibly that, you know, when someone comes walking in and they're like, oh, you know, all these nice things, what are some of odd things you don't really think about? Like, are there like upkeep on certain things that you need to kind of like keep an eye on when it comes to like, you know, old wood, and is there certain issues with like fabrics and stuff like that?
Yeah, so there are certainly things that you need to keep an eye on at museums. Like we have 2 humidexes in the museum, one for this area and one for the other area of the museum, that helps us monitor what the humidity is in the museum. We try to keep that as stable as possible in the winter, especially when it gets really dry. Like I've seen the humidex tell me, yeah, I'm only at 10%, and you should be at like 25, so turn on the humidifier and let it run for a little while and kind of start to stabilize things. So there's that, and it is definitely things like that. Like there's minute details with, like I said, things like the humidex, things like even just everyday curatorial practices, like the way that you would go about accessioning items and go about how to include them in your collection and where you're going to store them, and these are all things that we constantly have to juggle with, because pretty much every museum in the world, they struggle with storage space for their collection, like even the largest museums.
Well, I know even the BC Victoria, or is it Victoria Museum's doing a large overhaul.
Yeah,
there's a lot of controversy over the money spending on it, but
yeah, the Royal BC Museum, they're doing a complete overhaul of their building. There are some reasons as to why the expenses are so high, such as that they found asbestos in the building. They found out that the building is no longer up to seismic codes, so that's actually they're completely overhauling the building. It's not just an expansion or something like that a lot of people thought of, and that's expensive. And then another aspect of it too is that the collection that is there, and they have millions of artifacts in their vaults. in their collection, that all needs to get stored somewhere, and stored somewhere that is up to museum standards. It can't just go into you can't just rent out a U-Haul storage bin and throw everything in there. That doesn't work. It needs to be a proper storage space for museum items, and that's not cheap.
Lots of things you don't think about when it comes to running a museum.
For sure.
Definitely, for sure. So, do you mind if we have a quick little peek in and we
Sure.
can talk maybe like a little bit about some of the process that you guys do?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very cool environment in here. So you were mentioning essentially that a lot of the old military stuff got your personal attention into the industry. What has there been anything newer as to an interesting aspect of either something brought in that maybe really got your attention, possibly in the building here?
Yeah, so there's definitely some things like mostly actually the family stuff, like the items that are donated that are in connection to different families for the community, because that helps tell the story of the community as well as a whole when you cobble all of them together. And so like it's one thing to have somebody come in and be, oh well, here's some tree pruners for orcharding. It's like, yeah, that's important. That would be something that would be in Westbank. Whereas where does this one come from? Oh well, it's originally from Salmon Arm. So well, I mean, I'll take it. But there are items in museums that don't necessarily have a specific connection to that place in terms of that one item. Aside from that, it is something that would have been used. But when there is the aspect involved of the family displays and whatnot, and the family history attached to those items, like for example, later on in the museum, we have a tricycle.
Okay.
That is around, and that is the Griffin family tricycle. All the kids ended up using it.
Oh, that's so cool. We'll have to take a peek at that at some point. So give us a quick rundown. What's happening in this room? I think we got a couple different eras and locations essentially kind of being highlighted here. So.
Yeah. So this area that we're in right now, we call this the barn.
Okay.
It highlights the indigenous history of the area in a display here. We leave most of the indigenous history to the Sinchweps Heritage Museum. I hope I'm saying that right. And so we leave most of the story for their history to that, but we do have a small display talking about like there's the residential schools and that like that we acknowledge that we are on their territory and like what we're trying to do to decolonize the museum, which is another term that when some people hear it they kind of go but it's not. It's a lot more complicated than what.
It's definitely, they have their own story to tell with a lot of that stuff, and which I'm sure you want to just have a little bit of their story here, but
yeah, to at least acknowledge that.
As long, obviously with respect towards them being okay with certain stuff being in and whatnot.
And everything that is in the museum is stuff that they have said, yes, you guys can have this. Anything else, like anything that that comes in when people are trying to donate things that are indigenous of origin, we always either point them directly towards Sinchweps, or we immediately get in touch with them as, hey, this came through our doors, do you want it?
That's so awesome. Yeah, having that nice relationship is very important. I'm very
Absolutely.
Sure, so.
Yeah, we enjoy working with them, and we actively try to do more projects with them, and going forward, that is something we're trying to do.
Oh, that's cool. That's very
cool. But yeah, and then behind you we have our newest exhibit that we put in. It's on the fur trade in the area, and the Okanagan Fur Brigade Trail in particular. And this plaque that is in here is actually the original plaque from the cairn that is across the street in the Eleanor Reese Park.
Oh, so cool.
So yeah, and just some facts about that. And then we get more into industry stuff here. So we have sawmill, which is still a prominent industry today. There's Gorman Mills, which hires hundreds, if not more, employees. And the Gormans also being a significant historical family of Westbank as well.
That's the mill that's just on the outskirts there?
Yes.
Yeah, I drive by that a lot.
Yeah, and then this is it's not currently functioning, but it is a scale model of a sawmill.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, and it takes the chunks of wood that are back there, and by the time it gets down to this end, it is this size. So it does a very good job of demonstrating. And it actually at one point was up at the Gorman Mill as kind of somewhat of a training model.
Like a miniature almost, kind
Yeah.
of like showcasing. Yeah.
Yeah, for new employees and whatnot. And then it got brought here. And then we have an orcharding display, because orcharding and vineyards, it's a significant part of the economy for the whole Okanagan, not just for Westbank.
One of the main reasons people come here.
Exactly.
One of them at least, yeah.
Yeah, and then we have blacksmithing. There used to be a blacksmith in Westbank, actually, in that picture there. The building in the foreground is the old blacksmith shop.
Okay.
That used to be in Westbank back in the day, back in the early 1900s. And then there's more tools and so on, and then you get more into ranching and farming, which is a more forgotten part of Westbank's history. That, like, the first European to settle on the west side over here was Susan Allison and her husband, and they were actually ranchers. Yeah, they were ranchers in the 1890s, I want to say, or no, 1870s. And so they were that, and then they ended up moving on to Princeton. But they did spend time in this area as well. And then there's also the Fickies there. They up in Glen Rosa, they did a lot of ranching as well. They had grazing fields down by what is now Green Bay in Westbank, and then they would cattle drive from Green Bay up to Glen Rosa and back until the highway came through, and then that put an end to that.
So from the picture I'm seeing up there, it's approximately about 1910 was when
Yep.
a lot of this stuff was from.
Yeah, so there's a lot of the stuff it's through
could be,
various
yeah.
areas. This woolen set of chaps here, that's actually from some of the local family history as well. I can't remember off the top of my head right now which one donated it, but this has been an item that's been passed down like through generations, and then the owner of it from before, she came and generously donated it to the museum for us to have and put on display. So, yeah.
So how often do you go through stuff and have to turn people away, and it's like, yeah, this is like maybe like 15 years old or not even that old?
Well, the thing is that when people is that, like, I mean, I'm at the point that I'm pushing 30, and one of the things that is going to be that I think is going to be a problem that museums run into is that there's been this mindset of, oh, if it's 80s and 90s, it's not old enough, doesn't belong in a museum. We're getting to that point that it's old enough, like that we put out a call for like old flip phone cell phones and things like that.
The 80s is almost 40 years old.
Yeah.
So
like it's
we're getting up there.
Yeah, it's getting to that point.
Yeah.
But there's this mindset that, oh, it's not old enough, so it doesn't belong here. But museums are going to end up running into issues because then people are throwing their stuff away rather than donating it to a museum.
Well, even on like an eBay perspective of, like, you know, people have things having actual like core value. Like I'm sure, like, you know, you and me, I'm 30.
Yeah.
You know, growing up in the 90s, like the amount of like just odd toys and stuff like that, and, you know, oddities in that sense, like some of those are worth so much money now.
Oh, 100%.
Like, don't get me wrong, like these have essential value in different aspects. You know, some collectors like to have just a weird, or they could have a weird collection of, you know, military armaments, or
exactly,
you know, that aspect. And those, they essentially, as a collector's perspective, it's just like art in that way. There is money in that kind of stuff, and it's not not trying to say like you should sell everything, but at the same time, it's like when it comes to old possessions and that kind of stuff, it is a concept that you need to keep in mind.
Exactly, and the other thing is too, like, just to go back on the point that I was making with, like, that people think, oh well, 80s and 90s is not old enough. I mean, a lot of the stuff that was in here that got donated when the museum started in the 70s, that it was only made in like the 40s or so on, so it would have been around the same age.
Yeah, it's essentially the equivalent of back then when
Yeah.
it was in.
But for whatever reason, there was a different mindset with this older stuff that is more antique, shall I say.
I mean, it does also come into like the mass production side of things as well. So like there is quantity versus quality in that aspect too. So
For sure. But yeah, it's very rare that we end up turning a donation away. Usually, if we turn a donation away, it's because somebody has come through our door and is like, hey, do you guys want a piano? Do you guys want a grand piano? No. It better have a really good story. It better have a really good story, because the museum, it just got rid of 3 organs.
Oh, really?
And 2 pianos or something like that. Because where are you going to put them?
So, can you explain to me? I don't know if it's like a proper procedure. Do you ever decommission something that's in the museum, if that makes sense? Like put it to rest?
Yes, there is a procedure. It's called deaccessioning.
Okay.
So when you enter an item into the collection, it's called accessioning. When you take an item out of the collection, it's called deaccessioning, and there could be various reasons for deaccessioning an item. It could be for, if it's an Indigenous item, for reconciliation purposes, it then gets deaccessioned from our collection and then accessioned into the collection that it's going to. There can also be that an item gets broken. At the Fort St. John Museum, my first job that I had there, I ended up breaking one of those lamp chimneys, those glass lamp chimneys, and that was, and it was completely shattered, destroyed, and so it's you can't do anything aside from deaccession it. The other reason is that you're going through the collection and you find stuff that was brought into the collection back in like the 70s and 80s, when museum standards were not what they are today. And you sit there scratching your head, why do we have this? Why do we have 500 milk bottles? Kind of thing. Like when you need like 4.
There's a difference of like, as someone that wants to cherish history and give every little thing its time and attention, there is obviously going to be those cases that it's like, like you're saying, like, do you need to have 100 bottles set up and taking up a lot of space, and what do you do with it? So
yeah, and it all is taken into consideration. And then there's also sometimes, unfortunately, you find items that have been tucked away in some corner for forever that you finally got around to finding, and it ends up, and you end up getting to it, and it's like it's got mold on it or something. And unfortunately, a lot of museums, they don't have the budget to then properly repair damage like that. And so then you have to go through the process of deaccessioning, and there's proper procedures for that are set out by the Canadian Museum Associations, by the British Columbia Museum Association, and then there's even the International Commission of Museums, I think is what ICOM it's called, and they have international standards as well. So there's multiple different bodies at multiple different levels for that museums can refer to on what do I do for this kind of
situation. No, that's a very interesting concept that you don't really think about when it comes to just how do you not get rid of, but like, when you start piling up with a little bit too much stuff, essentially. So.
And when we deaccession, like the first option is we always put you always put the call out to other museums. Hey, does anybody want this? A lot of times, if it's common items like milk bottles, doilies is the other thing
Well,
that is.
and I mean, there's also like restaurants that want to have like an actual authenticity kind of look and stuff like that, and they they do try to take care of proper that kind of stuff. And
Yeah, they do what we try to do, but yeah, and that ends up becoming one of the steps. The first step is you go to museums. The second step is you go to other public educational institutions like libraries, universities, things like that, to see if they want it. If they don't want it, then you can start reaching out to like putting a call out to local businesses and whatnot, and so on. If there is if the item has inherent value, once you've exhausted all reasonable options to try to pass this item on to, if it has value, you can put it up for auction. And
obviously, the money comes back.
and then the museum, and then the money comes back to the museum. The museum has to put that money back into the collection, like into some kind of like whether or not it's to buy some equipment so that they can like an archival drawer or for archival materials or things like that.
Just extra steps or help with different aspects of the the museum in that sense.
Exactly.
There's lots of different. You could open a whole can of worms in regards to the museum needs this, the museum needs that, but yeah, no, I totally get that. I totally get that.
Yeah, but yeah, like I said, like deaccessioning, it's not a process that museums like to do necessarily because
They don't like to talk about it, but
it's not even necessarily that we don't like to talk about it. It's just it's one of those things that it is surprisingly time consuming because you have to do your due diligence.
Yeah.
And so like a lot of times you won't deaccession an item out of your collection unless it's like we need to take space considerations here or why do we have this? It's not relevant to our collection.
No, I totally get that. So cool. Let's keep moving around a little
Sure.
bit here. It's got a nice gemstone collection here.
Yeah, this is a work in progress. We are currently in the process of getting this collection shrunk down a little bit. It is a collection that was donated to us in the 1980s. A lot of these rocks and gemstones are not from the local area.
Oh.
Yeah, so like there's, for instance, the azurite there, that's from Arizona and things like that. Like there's the jade that is from BC and it could be potentially from the area, but
Hard to
Yeah.
isolate the fact if it was actually gathered here.
well, and even if it wasn't gathered here, if it's possible to find that here, then it's something that we'd like to keep. But there are a lot of the gemstones that are like it's from Brazil, kind of thing, and it's like it comes into the question of why do we have this kind of thing.
No.
So and we feel that there could be better homes potentially for these items than in our collection where it's not overly relevant.
But it does also come back to that first aspect that we talked about as to who had it. If it has that actual personal connection to someone in the family or Westbank's history as to their possession, essentially, then that's a different story.
That is true. Yeah.
So, very cool.
And then here we have our military display. And unlike a lot of museums with their military displays, they'll have all guns and bullets and helmets and whatever. We've taken the approach of personal items that they would have that the soldiers would have had. So like binoculars and their bags and their trench art from a bullet clip and their cap badges and things like that. And Westbank has a very deep military history. There are veterans dating back to the Second Boer War that have lived in Westbank. At some point in time, there's also the First World War, of course, and the Second World War, and then there were a few individuals that served in the Korean War, and then also quite a number that have served in wars since then. In all, a total of 12 Westbank individuals have unfortunately died in wars. There's, I think, 5 in that were killed in the First World War, 7 in the Second World War, most of them in the Air Force, and then there was 1 who was killed in the Korean War. So yeah, it's a deeper history for them, and Remembrance Day is definitely one of the times of the year that we try to be more involved in the community and be involved with the Remembrance Day ceremonies and so on. And this is just our general bar display that we have, and whatnot, and just some general items that would have been here, and you can see some old bottles like Orange Crush and Mountain Dew and whatnot. It's more so just for like a more fun display. It's not any particular theme or trying to represent any particular business per se, but it's bottles that would have, in theory, been in the area.
I notice you guys have QR codes around on some of your displays.
Yes.
Is that a fairly new
That's
development?
Within the past couple weeks. Yeah, we
Really?
we had 2 students from the UBCO training program their teaching program, and they were here doing their practicum. And we asked them what can we do to engage youth at the museum more, like to have our displays and whatnot be more engaging for a teenager when they're here, which is one of the hardest demographics to really engage with at museums in particular. And so what the idea that we came up with was, let's do the QR codes.
Well, and that's another element you have to try to think about, because when it comes to the internet and stuff like that, I don't want to say museums are old technology, but it is one of those things that it's what do you have anything to say in regards to direction that the museums are starting to shift towards in that sense?
A lot of museums, they've gone towards doing virtual tours. The virtual tours are a bit of a double-edged sword. That yes, they can give you that online presence and that online view of the museum without necessarily needing to be there. The other side of the sword is that they are very expensive to produce. So it's a lot of larger museums that will do these online tours and so on. But for us here, that isn't necessarily something that is within our budget unless we did a specific fundraiser to try and get something like that put up.
I've been seeing a lot more newer technology when it comes to 3D scanning objects and stuff like that, as to basically a full 360 angle of objects, essentially, with certain types of museums and collections and that kind of thing. So
yeah, and exactly, that is something that is on the that is upcoming. There's also the virtual reality as well, that a lot of museums will have the head goggles and whatnot. I don't think that technology is necessarily quite there yet, but it's getting there. Excuse me. But yeah, it's getting there. And so yeah, well,
it's one of those adaptive directions, at least, as a kind of, different museums have different, obviously budgets and stuff is one thing.
Exactly. I think the other thing that really helps museums is that there are grants out there for us to bring in summer students to work and have them get work experience during the summer when they're in high school and in university and so on, and having these younger people coming in and working at a museum and getting their perspective on
new, fresh minds.
Exactly. Getting their perspective on what can we do?
Yeah.
What would make this more interesting to you?
When you walk in here, what makes, or what's a sore spot for you? Definitely make it a little more eye-catching, or different aspects.
But yeah, so the QR codes, the 2 students that we had, that was part of what they did, was they developed all the different QR codes and put them throughout the museum for the relevant sections. And some of them, it's different websites. A lot of them link to our website and the information that we have. And it's really for additional information. that the display doesn't necessarily tell.
Well, and then there's the other aspect where it's just, if it's a little busier, or you can't do a personal tour or whatever in that sense, and they can just find out the extra information.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Maybe move along a little bit here. So, do you have a certain section that's a little more rotational as to like what you get in the museum?
Yeah. So for our different rotating exhibits, this is it. This is in our in-house here anyway. Is we rotate out the display cases that are in the visitor center section here, but we overall keep everything else relatively static. We'll add to the different displays, but I personally am happy with where the museum is at with the displays that we have right now for the static ones. And then we also have 2 satellite displays. So we have one out at the Heritage retirement home.
Oh, okay. So you basically have like a little spot, and you rotate stuff out into that particular one.
Yeah, we'll go and we'll do the displays. We'll design displays to go in there, and then we also have another satellite display at the library. So those are the 2 locations that we generally have them at, and then we do the what is it that I'm trying to think of, and then like we try to gear those displays towards like what would be interesting for the people that are going to be here. So for the heritage residents, we'll try to do displays that are going to be more interesting to the people that are living in the retirement home. And then at the library, it's like what's going to be engaging for someone that's going to be here, without taking away from what the library is doing.
Yeah, that's very fair. Oh, that's very cool. Let's have a quick power through.
Sure.
And we'll touch on a couple little things. And
Yep. So yeah, we have general store display. We have our creepy doll display over there too.
Hey, man, some people really like creepy dolls.
They do, and I mean some of them are kind of cute, but there's definitely a couple of them in there that are
like
a little
Chucky.
creepy. But yeah, and then we have a lot of examples of women's clothing through the years. Old men's clothing is harder to come by.
Yeah.
Men usually
Wear it
until it gets worn out, and then basically what we say is the church clothes became the work clothes, and then the work clothes got thrown out. So
no, that's a very fair aspect that overlooked.
yeah, and I mean like it's also there was a lot more different styles for women as well throughout history, and even in the same time periods. Like whereas men, it was very much for a large, and even to some extent today, suit and tie.
Yeah, pretty whitewash bland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like being able to show that, and even like having some of the different cultural diversity with having like a kimono in here, because there is historically a Japanese presence in Westbank with families like the Itanis, and then there's also Chinese presence with the Mar family as well. And there's actually still members of, I believe, both of those families still living in Westbank today. So
very cool. Has anyone ever damaged anything in your presence of working with?
Not since I've been here.
No.
No.
I know you've only been at this location for just over a year, but
I haven't had any instances of people of guests touching stuff they weren't supposed to and damaging it. Most people, when they're coming through museums, they're relatively respectful of it, and if they see a "do not touch" sign, they don't. It's mostly kids, because little kids will go, "Oh, what's that?" and naturally try to grab it out of curiosity. But I haven't seen any issues with it necessarily where something's been broken. grabbed and ran around with, yes, but not broken. And here's the tricycle that I was talking about, for
The
example.
temptation is there, but
It is. Well, there's one pedal
Yeah, the
missing,
pedal
so
missing,
that kind of helps.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is the Griffin family tricycle that I was talking about earlier.
Oh, that's so cool.
So, and yeah, it was all, I believe, 9 kids. It went from the oldest one, got handed down all the way down to the youngest one.
Could use a
So-
tune-up.
So yeah, and then this is our Pioneer Home display. It is more representative of a upper middle class to upper class Pioneer home, was between the furniture and the styling of it. But and so that is something to keep in mind when you're going through. This is not necessarily representative of every single Pioneer home, but of the more upper middle class.
I absolutely love these couches.
Mm-hmm.
I love the green.
Yeah, they're comfortable too. When we had our Christmas event this past Christmas, we had Santa in, and Santa was in the chair.
Okay.
So yeah, it was fun for that. And
Got the dining set over here.
mm-hmm.
That's not uranium glass, is it?
I don't think so.
I was gonna say that's uranium glass was like the 70s or something, or 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah, this house, it tries to represent the a time frame between, I want to say, the 20s to the 50s. So yeah, and so got a kids room and
Kitchen.
kitchen and whatnot. And you might have noticed our little beavers and bears that we have throughout the museum. That's a scavenger hunt for the kids
Oh, that's awesome.
that we do. And
Yeah.
if the kids find all the beavers and bears, they get a prize.
If I find all the beavers, do I get a prize?
I mean,
Replay the live stream. Let's go.
depends on if you want if you want the prizes that we have for the little kids. They're mostly like little just squishy toys and things like that. But yeah, and then this is our archival
Okay.
area here.
Yeah.
It's for where we have we call it our resource library. So we have different family files and different information books and so on, as well as a copy of every single one of the Okanagan Historical Society reports.
So when it comes to, when you look at pictures and stuff like that, right? When you have an old photo in that sense, obviously for the technology of the time back then, there wasn't a lot of pictures. There wasn't a lot of people with cell phones and taking pictures and selfies of everything in that sense. How, like, going forward, like I know we touched really briefly on the aspect of, like, 80s is now 40 years old. When it comes to basically being able to think about potential things that you would want to hang on to as a museum aspect, where do you even start with that?
In terms of things like photographs with...
Not necessarily just photographs, but like, going forward, like obviously we can touch on the eras and all that aspect, but it's like, you don't just go into your garage and be like, maybe I'll put this in a museum one day.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, almost anything can end up in a museum, like, because it's things that we use. Like, if you have it because you used it at one point or planned on using it.
I guess one of those bigger things would most likely be just technological advancement.
Exactly.
So if something like, if we start being able to communicate through our minds from some sort of computer chip or something like that, all those old 90s phones and like cell phones, like I'm sure there will be those displays of like certain evolutions of like, that kind of technology. I'm just saying, hypothetically speaking.
Oh, there's some museums where like that they have been taking those steps of like and being quite aggressive about it, of like, we want newer stuff as well, so that they can do that. So showcase that, like even for us, like if we go over here, there's our camera. We have a fairly extensive camera collection, actually, and you can see from over here that like we kind of have that, not necessarily in chronological order, but you can tell from like the old cameras to,
Yeah.
I want to say, like the 80s.
Yeah, those guys are getting up there. I think that's also another aspect too. Is like I think when a lot of newer museums these days are becoming the museum of blank, if that makes sense. There's a complete difference of like a local museum, and then there's the museum of a particular history or of an object, essentially. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different museums, and in tourism destinations, that kind of stuff makes sense.
Yeah.
Like down in Kelowna, you have granted they're all under the umbrella of the Kelowna Museum, but you have the Kelowna Museum, which is just the heritage, the general heritage museum for the Okanagan as a whole, and then you have the Military Museum, you have the Laurel Packing House, which is more an event venue than a museum, but still it's a historic building.
They've got some cool stuff in there.
And then they also have the orcharding and winery museum. So even in Kelowna and smaller cities like there, you have these specific things that are tied to the local area still. But in terms of like Museum of Illusions is the thing. Now, why I don't know, but I've been into a couple in my travels, and it's like this is just a small scale science world.
Yeah. No, I get that.
And so those like having those different topical museums in tourism destinations, like it's very like especially over in Europe, it's been catching like in Budapest. There's the pinball museum, which is the largest collection of pinball machines, and some of them you can still go and play, and that place is cool.
I think one of my coworkers recently went to that.
Yeah, it's very cool. So there's definitely a place for museums like that, but there is still a place for museums that are directed towards like this is the local history. So which is what we are here and what we try to primarily focus on.
Yeah, no, it's all very interesting, and it's there's so many different directions you can go into understanding how just the core mechanics of a museum just from the ground up in that sense. And well, I really do want to thank you, Brenden, for giving us a quick little showcase and step into your mind as to what makes a museum and a historian. And one last question I will ask you though is anyone who is intrigued or interested in becoming a historian, what were some of the things that you kind of overlooked or would give advice for?
So in terms of becoming a historian, it depends on what avenue you want to take. So if you want to become a professor, then like you got to go and do the PhD and whatnot and then get into a university. If you want to get into museums like the avenue that I chose to do, the biggest piece of advice that I can give to somebody that is starting out is don't get stuck in your bubble. Like there's even like looking at potential candidates through Young Canada Works, which is one of the programs that we can get summer students through, and you're going through the candidate list and there's people down in Vancouver and whatnot, and it's like, yeah, I want to work in museums. That's my career ambition. Are you willing to go anywhere to do the work? No, I want to stay in Vancouver. So like that's my biggest piece of advice is don't be afraid to take those smaller jobs. The other thing, especially at the start of your career, the pay is not going to be great. It's like you are working for experience, because museums pay what they can. They don't try to skimp people on funding for positions, but they will. But sometimes like the budget's just not there.
You're not making $1 million a year. No, it's definitely it's a passion job as well.
One of my favorite moments, I had an interview with the museum in Jasper, and one of the questions they asked me was, so how do I know that halfway through this term, through this work term, you're not just going to take off and go work in the oil field or something? Because if I wanted to make money, I wouldn't even be at this job interview.
Yeah, no, people love their craft, and people love, it's not about the money. It's sometimes like obviously it's nice having a little bit of support, but it's not always about the money.
Exactly. And so like that's my biggest piece of advice is be willing to go somewhere. And I at least I find it like it's exciting to be going somewhere. Like I bounced around all over the place. Like working in BC, like that I've been down in Oliver, I've been up in my hometown, and now I'm here. And so to be having that experience and bouncing from place to place, it shows that you can adapt quickly and that you can be more diverse and you can have a more diverse knowledge and understanding of different aspects of local communities and so on, because even though every community has its own story, there are parallels between them in development, and just the different stages of development might have been happening at different times. So yeah, just don't be afraid to move. Go where the work is.
Pretty much. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
Brenden.
thanks for having me.
Brenden Studer from Westbank Museum. I'm Rylan Kinnan. I've got Rob O'Day on the camera behind you there. Thanks so much for tuning in. Catch you guys next time.